Fine, let's start. Number 1. The Silurian Hypothesis. Picture a geologist on a hillside, tapping a hammer into a slab of shale that is 50 million years old, splitting it open like a book, and asking a strange question. If a civilization as advanced as ours had lived and died in this rock, would there be anything left to find? That question was formalized in 2018 by Gavin Schmidt, the director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, and Adam Frank, an astrophysicist at the University of Rochester. They published it in a serious journal of astrobiology. The name is a playful nod to an old reptilian species from a 1970 science fiction show. It is not a claim that lizards built cities. The idea grew out of a real problem. Scientists searching distant planets for signs of alien technology needed to know what such signs would even look like. Frank and Schmidt turned that question around and pointed it at Earth's own past. Here is the unsettling part. Human industry is only about 300 years old. Our planet is 4.5 billion years old. Fossilization is rare. Old exposed rock is limited. Cities, roads, and machines would be ground to nothing by erosion and swallowed by the slow recycling of the planet's crust. So the two researchers stopped looking for objects and started looking for chemistry. An industrial society leaves fingerprints in the sediment. A spike in carbon isotopes from burning fossil fuels. Synthetic nitrogen from fertilizer. Traces of rare metals, plastics, and strange manufactured molecules. Even long-lived radioactive fallout, like plutonium-244, which takes about 80 million years to half decay. They pointed to a real event, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, 56 million years ago, whose sudden carbon signature looks eerily like what an industrial age might leave behind. They were careful. They were not saying a lost civilization existed. They were testing whether we could ever know. And the answer that keeps people awake is this. In deep time, absence of evidence is barely evidence of absence. The record is simply too full of holes. There are 3 ways to hold this. The mainstream reading treats it as rigorous method, a mirror held up to our own search for alien life. A speculative reading wonders whether something really is hidden down there, unread, and a dismissive reading calls the whole thing a distraction. The idea also feeds the Fermi Paradox, the puzzle of why we see no clear signs of other technological life, and its grim cousin, the Great Filter. Some critics counter that traces like anomalous ore depletion or fossils of manufactured materials might survive and have simply never been recognized. But here's the part that should land in your chest. Our own species could vanish tomorrow, and given enough time, the entire story of humanity could fade into a record too faint for anyone to prove we were ever here. Which raises a deeper question. If life can leave so little trace, where did our own life even begin? Number 2. Directed Panspermia. Francis Crick, one of the 2 men who unraveled the structure of DNA, sat with a problem he could not shake. Every living thing on Earth, from bacteria to blue whales, uses almost exactly the same genetic code. Why would a code that arose by accident be so perfectly universal? In 1973, Crick and the chemist Leslie Orgel published a paper with a startling answer. Perhaps life did not begin here at all. Perhaps microbes were deliberately sent to Earth aboard an unmanned spacecraft by an advanced civilization somewhere else. They called it directed panspermia. Their clues were strange biochemical details, like life's odd reliance on the metal molybdenum, which they thought might reflect the chemistry of a distant homeworld. Crick later softened the idea, calling it speculation, but it sat inside a much older tradition. In the 19th century, Physicists like Lord Kelvin and the chemist Svante Arrhenius argued that life spores could drift between worlds, pushed along by the pressure of starlight. A gentler version, called Lithopanspermia, imagines microbes riding inside rocks blasted off a planet by an asteroid strike, shielded from radiation on the long journey. And there is evidence that life is tougher than we assumed. A bacterium called Deinococcus radiodurans survives radiation that would kill almost anything. Tiny animals called tardigrades were exposed to the raw vacuum of space on an orbital mission in 2007 and lived. When the Murchison meteorite fell in Australia in 1969, scientists found dozens of amino acids inside it, clearly formed in space. NASA's comet missions have found the amino acid glycine drifting in the cosmos. Panspermia does not solve the origin of life. It moves it. It pushes the question to another world and an earlier time. Critics point out the brutal difficulty of surviving millions of years of interstellar radiation. When the object called Oumuamua passed through our solar system in 2017, the first known visitor from another star, interest surged, though no biology was found. The astronomers Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickramasinghe became the idea's most famous later champions, though their claim that comets deliver disease to Earth is firmly rejected by mainstream science. The chemist Svante Arrhenius had coined the modern term around 1903. There are three ways to read this. Mainstream science favors abiogenesis, life arising here from Earth's own chemistry. A middle position takes lithopanspermia seriously, since we know rocks travel between Mars and Earth, and the boldest version keeps Crick's-directed seeding alive as a real, if untested, possibility. Whichever is true, the idea does something quietly enormous. It suggests that the word Earthling might be wrong, that terrestrial life could be a colony, not an origin, and that your oldest ancestor may have been a traveler from a star that no longer exists, which forces an even closer question. What exactly are you made of? Number 3. The Endosymbiotic Theory. Roughly 2 billion years ago, one single-celled organism swallowed another, and then, fatefully, did not digest it. That one act of failed digestion may be the reason you are alive. This is the endosymbiotic theory, and it was championed by the biologist Lynn Margulis in a 1967 paper. The idea was so radical that it was reportedly rejected by around 15 journals, and she was ridiculed for years. Today, it is in every textbook. Earlier thinkers had glimpsed it. The Russian botanist Konstantin Mereshkovsky around 1905 and Ivan Volin in the 1920s, but they lacked the evidence to convince anyone. The claim is simple and staggering. The mitochondria that power your cells, the tiny structures that turn your food and oxygen into energy, were once free-living bacteria. So were the chloroplasts in plants. At some point in deep time, they were engulfed by a host cell and never left. The proof arrived through molecular biology. Mitochondria carry their own circular DNA separate from the DNA in your cell's nucleus, and it looks like bacterial DNA. They have bacterial-style ribosomes. They are even vulnerable to some antibiotics that target bacteria. And they reproduce by splitting in two, on their own schedule, exactly the way bacteria do. Genetic sequencing traced them home. Mitochondria descend from a group called the alpha-proteobacteria. Chloroplasts descend from cyanobacteria. The merger that created mitochondria happened somewhere between 1.5 and 2 billion years ago, at the very origin of complex cells, and that merger was the key that unlocked everything after it. Efficient energy meant cells could grow larger and more demanding. Every animal, every plant, every fungus traces back to that union. The host cell, most researchers now think, was an archaeon, which means your cells are a fusion of two entirely different domains of life, welded into one. Margulis pushed the idea further into more contested territory, and not all of her later claims held up. That is worth sitting with. A scientist can be brilliantly right and still overreach. but the core is solid. There is another quiet consequence here. Mitochondria are passed down almost entirely from the mother, which is a thread we will pick up later. Consider what this means for the word you. You are not a single, unified being. Every one of your cells is a cooperative, descended from an ancient act of one organism capturing another and holding it forever. There are competing views about the exact steps, but the merger itself is not in doubt. And here is the part that should stop you. Every breath you take feeds bacterial machinery inside trillions of your cells. Ancient captives you can never release and cannot live without. So if your body is this old and this strange, why did the human mind take so astonishingly long to switch on? Number 4. The Sapient Paradox. Imagine two human skulls side by side, and imagine that 100,000 years separates them. They are nearly identical, the same brain size, the same anatomy. Yet one belonged to someone who left behind almost nothing, and the other to someone who could, given the chance, build a city. That gap is the puzzle the archaeologist Colin Renfrew named the Sapient Paradox in the mid-2000s. Here is the shape of it. Anatomically modern humans appeared between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. Fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco push our biological origin back to about 300,000 years. But the things we call civilization, farming, cities, writing, appear only in the last 10 to 12,000 years. If our brains were fully modern for that entire stretch, why did it take so long to do anything with them? For years, the answer was a sudden switch, a genetic change around 40 to 50,000 years ago that flipped on the modern mind. But the evidence resists that story. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, people were engraving patterns into ochre about 77,000 years ago. Shell beads turn up even earlier. Symbolic thought was clearly there, long before settled life. So the trigger may not have been biological at all. Renfrew offered a different model. He argued that when humans stopped wandering and settled down after the last ice age, a new relationship with objects, property, and place slowly reshaped how their minds worked. The stable, warm climate that began about 11,700 years ago made farming possible. And sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, with monumental stone architecture around 11,500 years ago, show that complex ritual construction came even before agriculture, tangling the simple cause and effect story. Renfrew and the archaeologist Lambros Malafouris pushed this further into what they called material engagement theory, the idea that thinking itself extends outward into the objects we make and handle. There are 3 ways to explain the gap. The old view says a cognitive switch flipped in the brain. Renfrew's view says the change was social, driven by settling down and by engaging with the material world. A third view says the paradox is partly an illusion, that perishable evidence of complex behavior simply rotted away. What unites them is a humbling idea. Intelligence is not just the hardware you are born with. It is the software of accumulated culture, built up over 100 centuries, which means you are not smarter than an Ice Age hunter. You have simply inherited more. And if a single mind took that long to bloom, what happens when we ask whether the whole planet behaves like one living thing? Number 5. The Gaia Hypothesis. In the late 1960s, an inventor named James Lovelock was working for NASA, trying to design a way to detect life on Mars. He realized something that changed how he saw his own planet. You could tell a living world from a dead one just by reading its air. A neighbor, the novelist William Golding, suggested he name the idea after the Greek earth goddess. He called it Gaia. The core claim, developed with the biologist Lynn Margulis, is that life and the physical environment form a single, self-regulating system that keeps the planet fit for living things. Lovelock's insight came from chemistry. Earth's atmosphere is in a strange imbalance, with oxygen and methane coexisting when they should react and cancel out. Only the constant activity of life keeps that imbalance going. Mars and Venus, by contrast, have still settled atmospheres dominated by carbon dioxide. To Lovelock, that stillness was the signature of a dead world. The theory tries to explain some remarkable stabilities. Atmospheric oxygen has stayed near 21%. Global temperature has remained in a livable band. Ocean salinity has held steady. Most striking of all, the sun has grown about 30% brighter since Earth formed, yet the surface never cooked or froze permanently. To answer critics who thought the idea implied the planet was consciously steering itself, Lovelock and Andrew Watson built a simple model in 1983 called Daisy World. In it, black and white daisies competing to grow automatically stabilize the planet's temperature, with no intention at all. Feedback alone does the work. Not everyone accepted it. Evolutionary biologists like Richard Dawkins argued that natural selection cannot act on a whole planet because a planet does not reproduce or compete. So scientists split the idea into versions. A weak version that life strongly influences the environment is now simply accepted. A strong version that the planet actively optimizes itself is largely rejected. Somewhere in between lies live debate. The hypothesis went on to seed an entire modern field, Earth system science, which studies the planet's linked physical, chemical, and biological cycles as one connected system. Lovelock himself later warned, in his 2006 book The Revenge of Gaia, that human activity could tip the system out of its stable, self-regulating range. There are three ways to hold Gaia. As accepted science, life clearly shapes the air, oceans, and climate. As contested theory, the question is how far that self-regulation really goes. And as something almost spiritual, embraced by movements, Lovelock himself did not always endorse. Whatever version you take, it reframes prehistoric life completely. Life was never just a passenger riding on the geology. It was an engineer, building the atmosphere you breathe, which means you are not living on the planet so much as living inside a single vast process, 4 billion years old. And one of the most violent chapters of that process began when the world learned to see. Number 6, the light switch theory. On a dark seafloor, 521 million years ago, the first true eye opened. And for the first time in the history of the planet, light became information. The Australian biologist Andrew Parker argues that this single moment set off one of the strangest events in the fossil record. It is called the Cambrian explosion, and it is when nearly all the major animal body plans burst into existence, beginning about 540 million years ago. Parker's idea is called the light switch theory. Before vision, he argues, life was largely soft, slow, and simple. Then one animal evolved an eye that could form an image, and everything changed. Predators could now hunt by sight. Prey had to run, hide, or armor up. An evolutionary arms race ignited almost overnight in geological terms. The evidence for the explosion is written in spectacular fossil beds. The Burgess Shale in Canada, discovered by Charles Walcott in 1909, and the Chengjiang site in China. Look at the creatures themselves. Anomalocaris, a meter-long Cambrian hunter, had huge compound eyes. A study of Australian fossils in 2011 found eyes with more than 16,000 lenses. Trilobites built their eyes out of calcite, which means they saw the world through lenses of stone, and those lenses fossilized in perfect detail. Vision reshaped everything that followed: camouflage, signaling, speed, and eventually the brain circuitry built to process images. And right alongside the eyes came the shells, spines, and armor, exactly the defenses you would expect once vision made hunting deadly. But this is genuinely contested ground, and honest science lays the rival explanations on the table. Some researchers argue the true trigger was rising oxygen, finally crossing the threshold needed to power large, active animals. Others point to a burst of new genetic tools, the Hox genes that let bodies build complex plans. Others credit a flood of nutrients into the oceans after the breakup of an ancient supercontinent, or the thaw at the end of a global snowball Earth glaciation. Critics of the light switch theory say the eye was just one innovation among many appearing together. So the honest verdict is that vision was probably not the only cause, but it may have been the spark that turned a slow world fast. And here is the thread that runs to you. The entire vertebrate lineage, the branch that leads to fish, to mammals, to primates, to you, evolved inside that visual arms race. The whole visible animal world may exist because 500 million years ago, light was suddenly turned into information. And from that explosion of life, one small and unremarkable creature would eventually carry your entire lineage through the worst day in Earth's history. Number 7. The single placental ancestor. A small shrew-like animal crouches under a fern in the dark, its heart hammering, while the horizon burns orange and the great reptiles die around it. That creature, or something very like it, may be the ancestor of every placental mammal alive, including you. In 2013, a team led by Maureen O'Leary of Stony Brook University published a reconstruction of that ancestor in the journal Science. The project was enormous. The researchers combined more than 4,600 anatomical traits with genetic data from dozens of species to rebuild a creature no one has ever found. The result was a small insect eater, weighing perhaps as little as a few grams with a furry tail. From that single lineage descends Placentalia, the group that contains more than 5,000 living species. Humans, whales, bats, elephants, mice, nearly every mammal you can name. Here is where it becomes contested, and the disagreement is real. O'Leary's team concluded that this ancestor lived just after the Great Extinction, not before it. The extinction is the Cretaceous-Paleogene event, 66 million years ago, when an asteroid about 10 kilometers wide slammed into what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico and wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs along with about 75% of all species. Their findings supported an explosive model in which placental mammals erupted into the empty world within a few 100,000 years of the impact. But molecular clocks, which estimate ages from genetic mutation rates, often tell a different story. They place the origin of placental lineages deep in the Cretaceous, living quietly alongside the dinosaurs. This is the hinge of the whole debate. The fossils seem to show a boom after the impact. The genes seem to whisper of a much longer, older fuse. Reconciling the two is one of the live arguments in the field. Fossils like Protungulatum and the earlier Eomaya, about 125 million years old, sit right at the center of it. The reconstructed ancestor was inferred to have a two-horned uterus, a brain with a folded neocortex, and to give birth to a single, well-developed young, the deep roots of human placental biology. The team even built an open database called Morphobank, so anyone could examine the vast matrix of traits behind the claim. Mammals had existed for over 100 million years before the asteroid, but they stayed small and marginal in a world ruled by dinosaurs. Only when the giants were gone did mammals inherit the Earth, and that is what makes this theory land so hard. Your entire existence, the whole mammalian story, may hang on one small creature surviving a single catastrophic night. Pull that thread and everything unravels. But survival is only half the story, because the very air that little creature breathed was itself the product of an ancient disaster. Number 8. The Oxygen Catastrophe. Around 2.5 billion years ago, a tide of poison began to fill the sky, and it was produced by life itself. We call the air we breathe clean and life-giving, but to the organisms that ruled the young Earth, oxygen was toxic. This is the Great Oxidation Event, sometimes called the Oxygen Catastrophe, and it may have been the first mass extinction in history. The culprits were cyanobacteria, the blue-green bacteria that learned to photosynthesize, using sunlight to make energy and releasing oxygen as waste. Before them, Earth's atmosphere was almost free of oxygen, a mix of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and methane, and it was ruled by microbes that lived without it. As oxygen accumulated, it caused chemical damage to those anaerobic organisms. Many were driven to extinction or forced to hide in the few remaining oxygen-free corners of the planet. Life, in other words, poisoned its own world. The evidence is written in stone. Banded iron formations, layered red and dark rocks found across the globe, formed as oxygen reacted with iron dissolved in the oceans and made it rain out to the seafloor. A subtle shift in sulfur isotopes in rocks younger than about 2.4 billion years marks the moment the atmosphere changed. And there was a brutal side effect. The new oxygen destroyed atmospheric methane, a powerful greenhouse gas, and its loss may have triggered the Huronian glaciation, one of the most extreme ice ages Earth has ever known, possibly lasting 300 million years. But catastrophe and creation are the same event here. Oxygen made a far more efficient kind of metabolism possible. Aerobic respiration releases much more energy than the older oxygen-free chemistry, and that energy would eventually power complex, active life. The path was not smooth. After the initial event, oxygen levels fell and stayed low through a vast, sluggish stretch of time before rising again near the dawn of animals. The geologist Preston Cloud was among the first to read the banded iron rocks as a record of this transformation, and there was a lasting gift buried inside the disaster. The same oxygen slowly built an ozone layer high in the atmosphere, the ultraviolet shield that would one day let life crawl out of the sea and onto dry land. There are competing framings worth holding side by side. One treats it as a pollution catastrophe, the first great self-inflicted die-off. Another emphasizes how gradual and staggered the process really was. A third frames it as pure creative opportunity, the moment that made animals possible. All three are partly true, but do not miss the point that touches you directly. Every breath you take depends on oxygen, and that dependence is the inheritance of an ancient poisoning that nearly ended life billions of years before you were born. Your body runs on the residue of a catastrophe, and that body, it turns out, was built for something very specific. Number 9. The Endurance Predator Hypothesis. Under the noon sun of the African savanna, a lone human is jogging, not sprinting, behind an antelope, following it at a steady pace across the shimmering heat, waiting for the animal to do the one thing it cannot avoid: overheat. This is persistence hunting, and in a landmark paper in the journal Nature in 2004, Dennis Bramble and Daniel Lieberman argued that it shaped the very design of the human body. Their hypothesis is that the genus Homo evolved not just to walk, but to run long distances, and that this ability was a way to hunt. Over extreme distances in heat, humans are among the best endurance runners in the entire animal kingdom. We can outlast animals that are far faster than us over a short dash. The reason is written into your anatomy. You have a ligament at the back of your neck that stabilizes your head as you run, a feature apes like chimpanzees lack. Your gluteus maximus, the large muscle in your backside, fires powerfully when you run, but barely when you walk. The list goes on. Your Achilles tendon and the arch of your foot act as springs, storing and returning energy with every stride, useless for walking, but vital for running. You have millions of sweat glands and mostly bare skin, letting you shed heat while still moving, while most four-legged animals must stop and pant to cool down. Your short toes, your springy legs, and the fact that your head is decoupled from your shoulders all point the same way. And crucially, you can breathe independently of your stride, while a galloping animal's breathing is locked to its gait so it cannot cool itself the way you can. These traits appear in Homo erectus roughly 1.5 to 2 million years ago, right as meat became a bigger part of the diet. Persistence hunting has actually been documented among the Sand people of the Kalahari and among a few groups in Mexico and Australia. And access to meat may have helped fuel the energy-hungry human brain. There are competing views. Some argue persistence hunting was central to our evolution. Others say it was rare and that scavenging or throwing weapons mattered more. Lieberman later argued that many modern illnesses come from a mismatch, bodies built for constant movement and now left still. The idea reached a wide audience through books like Born to Run, tying this ancient adaptation to modern running and the debate over running barefoot. Whichever emphasis is right, the conclusion is hard to shake. Right now, sitting still, you are carrying a body engineered over millions of years to run other animals to death in the heat. And that same long-lived body raises another strange question. Why do humans keep living so long after they can no longer have children? Number 10. The Grandmother Hypothesis. An older woman with silver hair kneels in the dirt of the Tanzanian bush, digging deep for tubers, and by the end of the day, she has outforaged nearly everyone in her band, feeding grandchildren who are not yet able to feed themselves. That image is the heart of one of the strangest ideas in human evolution. It tries to answer a real puzzle. Why do human women live for decades after menopause, when almost no other animal does? The Grandmother Hypothesis, crystallized by the anthropologist Kristen Hawkes and her colleagues from fieldwork with the Hadza hunter-gatherers in the late 1990s, offers an answer. Post-reproductive women increase the survival of their descendants by provisioning and caring for their grandchildren. By feeding weaned children, a grandmother frees her daughter to have more babies sooner. From the cold arithmetic of evolution, living long past childbearing is not wasteful at all, because a grandmother is helping copies of her own genes survive. Menopause typically arrives around age 50, yet women in many societies live well into their 70s and beyond, even without modern medicine, once they survive the dangers of youth. The idea builds on the biologist W.D. Hamilton's theory of kin selection, in which helping relatives who share your genes can be a winning strategy. It fits a broader picture of human life history as well: unusually long childhoods, closely spaced births, and cooperative breeding, in which raising a child takes far more hands than a mother alone. Mathematical models suggest that grandmothering could actually have driven the evolution of longer human lifespans. And humans are not entirely alone in this. A few other species show menopause, most famously killer whales and short-finned pilot whales. In orcas, post-reproductive grandmothers lead the pods, and studies found that calves were more likely to survive in lean years when a grandmother was still alive to guide them to food. It is a haunting parallel across the ocean. There are rival explanations, and good science holds them together. One is the mother hypothesis, that women stop reproducing simply to protect the children they already have. Another says menopause is just a byproduct of living longer for other reasons. Critics argue the survival benefit of grandmothering may be too small on its own to explain everything. But historical records from Old Finnish and Canadian church registries do show that children with a living maternal grandmother survived better. The theory reframes aging itself. Old age is not just decline. It may be an evolved, adaptive stage, central to why humans live long, form deep bonds, and raise children across generations. Your species may owe its very shape to grandmothers, and that shared human story leads to one final astonishing claim about where all of us come from. Number 11. Mitochondrial Eve and Y-Chromosomal Adam. Somewhere in Africa, deep in prehistory, a woman lived and died never knowing that every human being who would ever exist would carry a thread of her inside their cells. We call her Mitochondrial Eve. She is the most recent common ancestor of all living humans through the direct maternal line. The idea came from a landmark paper in 1987 by Rebecca Cann, Mark Stoneking, and Alan Wilson at the University of California, Berkeley. They studied the mitochondrial DNA of 147 people from around the world, drawn from many different populations and continents. Remember that mitochondria came from ancient bacteria and that they are passed down almost only from the mother. Because that DNA does not shuffle and recombine, it passes down the maternal line nearly unchanged, except for slow mutations that act like the ticking of a clock. Reading that clock, the researchers traced everyone back to a common ancestor in Africa who lived roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. There is a male counterpart. Y-Chromosomal Adam is the most recent common ancestor along the direct paternal line, traced through the Y chromosome that passes from father to son. Estimates for his age have ranged widely, from around 120,000 to more than 300,000 years, revised as more genomes were sequenced. It is worth remembering that these two lineages capture only 2 threads of your ancestry. The rest of your genome traces back not to 2 people, but to a whole population of their contemporaries. Now, here is the point almost everyone gets wrong. Eve and Adam did not necessarily live at the same time. They almost certainly never met. They were not the only 2 people alive. They were simply the individuals whose particular maternal or paternal line happened to survive unbroken all the way to the present, while countless other lines died out. The names are just nicknames from the press. They do not describe a literal first couple. And the identity of Eve can even shift forward through history, as lineages vanish. The 1987 study became foundational evidence for the out-of-Africa model of human origins. Later, fuller genome studies confirmed that recent African origin, while adding nuance, including interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans, and work on the Y chromosome around 2013, helped reconcile the timing of Adam and Eve. There are still debates at the edges between a strict single-origin story and more tangled models. But the central finding stands, and it is quietly overwhelming. Every person who has ever lived and everyone alive today shares a single ancestral mother and a single ancestral father. 2 strangers from the deep African past who never knew each other and never knew us. Step back from all 11, and a pattern comes into focus. Each of these theories works by knocking loose a comforting assumption, and each replaces it with something stranger and more humbling. 2 threads run through nearly all of them. The first is contingency. Your existence hangs on fragile accidents. 1 small creature surviving an asteroid. 1 cell swallowing another and holding on. 1 climate settling into stability at just the right moment. Change any of these by a hair, and the whole story collapses. None of it was guaranteed. Each of these events could have gone another way, and if it had, the branch that leads to you would simply never have formed. The second thread is the composite self. You are not a single, clean, unified thing. You are made of once separate parts, stitched together across billions of years. The Endosymbiotic Theory shows you are a fusion of ancient microbes. Mitochondrial Eve shows you are the tip of a single surviving thread out of countless broken ones. The Silurian Hypothesis and directed Panspermia push the frame outward, hinting that our origins may lie off the planet or far deeper in time than any rock can record. Gaia and the Oxygen Catastrophe reveal life as a planetary force, remaking the very air and oceans, not merely riding along on top of them. The Sapient Paradox humbles the mind itself, showing that your intelligence is mostly inherited culture rather than raw biology. The light switch theory and the single placental ancestor show how one event, a first eye, a lone survivor, can cascade into entire living worlds. And the endurance predator and grandmother hypotheses reach right into your own body and family, revealing the deep prehistory hidden in how you sweat, how you run, and how long you live. Notice, too, how many of these ideas were mocked before they were accepted. Lynn Margulis was rejected again and again. The molecular clock behind mitochondrial Eve was doubted. Science does not arrive certain. It argues, it self-corrects, and sometimes the ridiculed maverick turns out to be right. Other ideas here, like the Silurian Hypothesis and directed Panspermia, remain openly speculative, but they sharpen real questions rather than answering them. The point is not to hand you certainty. It is to widen the frame and to show how contingent and how composite you really are. Prehistoric life is not a separate, lost world sealed off from you. It runs, unbroken, straight into your body and your origin. And once you see that, a final and honest question remains. How much of this do we still not know? The truth is that much of this remains open, and that is the most exciting part. The origin of life itself is still unsolved. Panspermia only relocates the mystery to another world. It does not answer it. We cannot yet test whether an industrial civilization ever rose and vanished before us. The real trigger behind the Sapient Paradox is still argued over. Whether the placental ancestor lived before or after the asteroid remains genuinely unresolved, caught between the fossils and the genes. How far Gaia's self-regulation truly extends is still contested. Whether persistence hunting was central or merely a footnote is unsettled. Even the precise evolutionary math behind menopause is still debated, and that uncertainty is not a weakness. Every unanswered question here is an invitation. New methods, ancient DNA pulled from bones and dirt, and new ways of reading the chemistry of deep time keep revising these answers year after year. The deep past is an incomplete archive, and we are still learning how to read it. Each new fossil, each fragment of ancient DNA, each isotope measured in old stone can shift the story again, sometimes overturning what a textbook stated as fact only a decade ago. But the through line is clear enough to feel. Your existence is improbable, layered, and inherited. You are a colony of ancient cells. You are a single surviving lineage out of billions that ended. You are a body built for a hunt that almost no one runs anymore, shaped by grandmothers, breathing the residue of an ancient catastrophe, carrying a thread that reaches back to two strangers in prehistoric Africa. To sit here and question your own existence is to realize just how much had to happen, against staggering odds, for you to be able to ask the question at all. The strangeness was never a threat. It is simply the true size of the story you are part of. If the deep past still has questions for you, there is another investigation waiting on your screen right now, and subscribing keeps them coming.